He didn't expect to save a life that night. Not really. He was just driving home, same as any other night. And he sure didn't expect the girl he pulled from the fire to quietly rebuild his world from the inside out, piece by careful piece. If you've ever lost something you thought you'd never feel again, love, safety, home, this story might stay with you. It certainly stayed with him. This story is for people who still believe in quiet grace and second chances. Calder Miles, a rancher of 42, had been a widower for 11 years. Most folks around there knew him as the kind of man who kept to himself. Nights were quiet up at his place, away from the dust and the chatter of town. This particular night, though, felt different right from the start. He'd gone into town for supplies, feed, some lumber, the usual. The moon was a sliver, barely cutting through the clouds as he drove his truck through Blackwood Pass. It's a narrow stretch, bordered by deep ravines on one side. Then he saw it, a shimmer against the dark, a glow that wasn't the moon. Closer, it was a wagon, turned over, half swallowed by the ravine, and fully on fire. Black smoke choked the air, thick and acrid. His first thought was to keep going, call for help from the next town. But then he heard it. A small, ragged cough. Just once. Weak. It wasn't an animal. He slammed the brakes, grabbed his heavy work gloves. The heat was already licking at the air. Climbing down was tricky, the ground loose and crumbling. The fire was roaring now, chewing through the wood of the wagon, bright orange against the black night. He could feel it on his face, searing hot. The cough came again, closer. There was a shape, small, curled up against the wreckage, almost hidden by the smoke. He scrambled, pulling at the debris, ignoring the burning splinters. His lungs burned, but he kept going. He reached her, a girl, probably, pulling her free with one arm hooked around her middle. She was limp, but he could feel a faint pulse. The moment he dragged her clear of the wagon, pulling them both back up the steep bank, the whole thing exploded, a whoosh of flame that lit up the entire pass for a split second. Then, just the crackle and the smoke. She was injured, definitely, but didn't make a sound. Just silence. He got her back to the ranch somehow. He laid her out on the old couch in the living room, wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. She looked young, maybe 17, bruised and scraped, a cut on her forehead. Still, not a word out of her. He brought her a basin of clean water, some bandages. She didn't look at him, just stared at the ceiling. Her eyes were wide, dark, like empty wells. For days it was like that. She wouldn't speak, just sat by the fire, wrapped tight in that quilt, sometimes staring at the walls, sometimes just at the flames. Her presence felt like a ghost, quiet and still, not quite solid. Calder left meals for her on the small table by the couch, a plate of eggs and bacon in the mornings, stew for dinner. He'd set it down, make sure she saw it, then go about his chores. He kept his distance. He didn't know what to say, or even if she could hear him. The silence was thick, heavy, pressing down on everything. Sometimes he'd catch her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, a flicker of something in her dark eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or just nothing. It felt like walking on thin ice, never sure if she'd shatter or just vanish. He didn't push, just let her be. The ranch was quiet anyway, always had been. Now it was just a different kind of quiet, a waiting kind. After about a week, something shifted. Calder woke up one morning and the floor was swept. Not perfectly, but swept. Another day he found the eggs collected, neat in the basket. She didn't say anything, just did it. Little things, barely noticeable at first. The way the jars in the pantry were suddenly lined up, labels facing out. A piece of firewood he'd left on the porch, split and stacked neatly by the door. She moved like smoke, quiet and deliberate, always when he wasn't looking directly. He'd turn around, and a task would be done. It was unnerving in a way, this silent presence, but also useful. One afternoon, he came in from feeding the horses, covered in dust, and she was stirring a pot on the stove, something that smelled like herbs. He stood there watching her for a moment. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, surprised at how loud it sounded in the quiet kitchen. She didn't flinch, just kept stirring. Then, very softly, barely a whisper, she said, "Call me June." She didn't explain anything about the wagon, or the fire, or where she came from. He didn't press. It wasn't his place, he figured. The quiet around her was different now, not empty like it had been before, not hollow. It was a still kind of quiet, a calm, like the air before a gentle snowfall. The cabin didn't feel quite so empty anymore. A few days later, Calder went back to the pass. He didn't know why, just felt like he had to. The wagon was a charred skeleton, black against the grey rock. The smell of smoke still hung heavy, even after the last rain. He walked around, kicked at some ash, found a few things, a scorched metal buckle, a child's broken wooden toy. Then he saw them, 2 small, makeshift graves, just piles of stones, nothing more. One had Mama carved into a flat piece of slate, crude but clear. The other, Elijah, his stomach twisted. She'd done it herself then, buried them before the fire could take them too. That explained the quiet. That explained everything. He knelt, just looking at the names. Next to the Elijah stone, half buried in the soot, he saw it, a small, carved wooden flower. Delicate, a tiny bloom, miraculously untouched by the flames. It was the kind of thing a kid would carry, a comfort. He picked it up, dusted it off. It felt warm in his palm, even though the air was cold. When he got back to the ranch, June was sitting by the window, patching a tear in the old quilt. He walked over, held out the small flower. She looked at it, then at him. Her eyes were still guarded, but there was a flicker, something deeper this time. She took the flower from his hand, walked over to the mantel above the fireplace, and placed it there, right in the center. She didn't say a word. He didn't need her to. It was a gesture, clear as any spoken word, a shared understanding, quiet and heavy, between them. June started changing the cabin in small ways, little by little. It wasn't a sudden overhaul, more like a slow, steady tide coming in. The faded curtains in the kitchen, torn in places, were suddenly mended, stitches so fine he could barely see them. The old quilt he'd given her, patched where it was singed from the fire, now had a few new squares, sewn with scraps of fabric she must have found in a forgotten drawer. The shelves, once just stacked with his things, started looking organized. The tin cans were lined up, the old enamel plates were stacked just so. He came in one evening, and the soup she was making smelled different, richer. He watched her drop a few sprigs of something green from a small bag she'd produced. Herbs, he figured. His soup had always been just meat and potatoes. The pantry latch, which had always been finicky, suddenly clicked shut with a satisfying thud. It wasn't just things being fixed. It was like the cabin itself was breathing easier. He couldn't explain it. The air inside felt warmer, even though the weather hadn't shifted outside. The chill that had settled deep in the walls, the one he hadn't even noticed until it started to lift, was slowly fading. Sometimes, without even realizing it, he'd catch himself humming an old tune. A quiet, absent-minded sound, something he hadn't done in years. It was a small shift, maybe, but to him it felt as major as the earth turning on its axis. The wind had been brewing all day, low and mournful, but it hit the ranch hard that night, a sudden vicious storm, rattling the windows and groaning through the eaves of the cabin. Calder had gone out to check on the livestock, make sure the barn doors were secure. The wind howled, whipping his hat off his head. Rain was coming down sideways, cold and sharp. He was pushing against a protesting barn door when he heard a loud crack. The old shed, barely standing for years, was giving way. A support beam, thick and heavy, splintered, then started to fall. It was coming right for him. He froze, caught between the barn door and the collapsing shed. No time to move, no time to even think. Then, a blur, June. Small, fast, she was suddenly there, pushing against his back with surprising force, shoving him clear. The beam crashed down exactly where he'd been standing, shattering the ground, sending splinters flying. They stood there for a second, drenched, the wind screaming around them. She barely breathed, just looked at him, her eyes wide in the dim light of the storm. She didn't say anything, didn't even seem to be breathing hard. Just pulled him out of the way, quick and determined, like it was nothing. That night, by the fire, she sat on the floor, quietly mending a tear in his old work coat, the one he'd ripped checking on the livestock. He watched her, the needle glinting in the firelight. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the small, steady movement of her needle. It wasn't long after that the routines started to intertwine. Naturally, he didn't ask her to, she just knew. He'd leave out the kindling and chopped wood by the hearth each morning, and by the time he came in for breakfast, the fire would be lit, a low, warm glow already filling the cabin. She started making cornbread from scratch, the smell of it filling the air, sweet and comforting. He found himself washing the dishes without thinking, scrubbing the pans while she swept the floor. They still barely spoke, maybe a word or two, mostly about the weather or the day's chores, but the air between them, that tight, watchful space that had always been there, softened. It wasn't empty anymore. Calder found himself listening for her, the quiet tread of her boots on the wooden floorboards, the soft clatter of a plate, the rustle of paper as she turned a page of an old book. Before her, the cabin had been a place where only his footsteps echoed. Now, there were 2 sets of sounds, 2 rhythms, and he found that he liked the sound of hers. He'd be out in the barn, or mending a fence, and an instinct would tell him she was in the kitchen or out by the chicken coop. The ranch wasn't just his place anymore, it was theirs, and it was a strange, unsettling, but welcome feeling, like coming home to a house that wasn't quite so cold. It was only a matter of time before the whispers reached the sheriff. News travels slow but sure in these parts, and a single rancher suddenly having a young girl living with him, no explanation, well, that raises eyebrows. Sheriff Brody rode up one afternoon, his horse kicking up dust. He dismounted, tipped his hat, but his eyes were hard. "Calder," he said, nodding towards the cabin. "Heard you got a boarder." There was suspicion in his voice, judgment. He could tell the sheriff was trying to figure out what kind of trouble he was in, or causing. Calder didn't offer details, didn't feel like he owed him any. "She's here," he said, plain as day. "Pulled her from a wagon fire in the pass. Her family, they didn't make it." The sheriff shifted his weight, still watching him. "No kin to take her in?" Calder just shook his head. "She ain't caused no trouble," he added, his voice low. "She's not in my way. Truth is, Sheriff, she's the reason I still draw breath." It sounded dramatic, even to his own ears. But it was true. Something about her quiet presence had brought him back from a place he didn't even know he was in. Later that night, after Brody had ridden off, June left a plate of biscuits on the table. Fluffy, still warm, and carved into the top of one, clear as day, was a single word. "Thanks." She must have overheard. They were deep into the dry season, the air crackling with static, hot and heavy. Then the sky turned that bruised purple-black color, and the dry lightning started. Streaks of white fire ripping through the clouds, one after another, but no rain, not a drop, just the booming, cracking thunder that shook the ground. Calder was in the barn, checking on the nervous horses, when he noticed June wasn't in the cabin. He looked everywhere. Finally, he found her, curled up, small as a field mouse, under a pile of hay tarps in the darkest corner of the barn. She was trembling, hands pressed over her ears, eyes squeezed shut. He knelt beside her, slowly, not wanting to startle her. "June," he said, his voice soft. She didn't move. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, vibrated through the barn floor. She flinched, a raw primal fear on her face. Then in a whisper he had to lean close to hear, barely audible over the next boom, she said, "The fire started with thunder." It was the most she'd ever said about it, about asterisk, anything asterisk, just that one sentence, and it explained everything. The fire, the thunder, the fear that still gripped her, deep down. He didn't say anything, didn't try to comfort her with words. He just sat down next to her, leaned back against a hay bale, and stayed there, all night, until the sky finally cleared, the dry lightning faded, and the first pale light of dawn broke through the barn doors. Calder found the fabric in an old chest his wife used to keep in the attic, scraps of cotton, faded calico, small pieces of velvet, all the bits and pieces she'd saved for her quilting. His wife Sarah had loved to quilt. Her projects were always spread across the dining room table, a riot of colour and pattern. After she passed, he just shut the chest and left it, never thought about it again, until now. June's blanket, the one he'd given her that first night, was still singed in places, frayed at the edges where the fire had licked at it. It was a good blanket, but it held the memory of the fire. He brought the chest downstairs and put it by her chair. She looked at it, then at him, then back at the fabric. Without a word, she began. She worked slowly, carefully, her small hands moving with unpracticed grace. She cut the old fabrics into squares, then stitched them, one by one, into the singed parts of the blanket, like mending a wound. Each stitch seemed to erase a little bit of the char, replacing it with something new, something softer. That night he found her sleeping on the porch, wrapped tight in the mended quilt. The air was cool, but she looked peaceful, utterly at rest, the first time he'd seen her truly relaxed. He watched her for a long time, the moonlight on her face. The cabin had felt haunted for so long, filled with the quiet echoes of loss. But looking at her, wrapped in those mended memories, he realized it didn't anymore, not one bit. A week later, a boy went missing from town. Young Billy Miller, not more than 8 years old, wandered off into the woods during a game of hide-and-seek. The whole town was out, shouting his name, combing the brush, their faces grim. When the call came through to the ranch, Calder immediately saddled his horse. He knew these woods better than anyone, but when he got back to the cabin, June was already there, waiting by his horse, a canteen of water and a small bag of dried meat strapped to her belt. She didn't say a word, just nodded, ready. She didn't track like he did, looking for broken branches or deep footprints. She looked for the small things, a disturbed ant trail, a tiny scuff mark on a rock, a specific kind of moss displaced, signs that he, for all his years in the wilderness, would have overlooked. She moved through the woods, silent and focused, her eyes scanning the ground, missing nothing. She led him deep into a dense thicket, a place no one else would have thought to look, and there he was, Billy, huddled under a fallen log, scared but unharmed. They brought him back, and the townsfolk who had always viewed June with suspicion, with wary glances and hushed whispers, now regarded her with something new, respect. Not complete acceptance, maybe, but respect. You could see it in the way they stood a little straighter when she passed, the way their eyes held less judgment. June's transformation of the kitchen was the most profound. It wasn't about new things, not really, but about making the old ones sing. Dried herbs, picked from the hills around the ranch, now hung in neat bunches from the ceiling beams, releasing their earthy scent. The old iron pans, once crusted with years of burnt-on food, were now polished to a dark sheen, reflecting the firelight. Small, simple decorations appeared, a cluster of wild flowers in an old mason jar, a smooth river stone placed just so on the windowsill. The kitchen, which had always been purely functional, a place to cook and eat, suddenly felt like the heart of the home. Calder walked in one evening, and the air was thick with the smell of fresh-baked bread, herbs and something else, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. It smelled like his mother's kitchen used to, full of life and care. They ate by the fire that night, just the two of them, in total silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames, the soft scrape of spoons against bowls, and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. He looked around at the small changes, the way the light fell on the polished pans, the gentle sway of the herbs, and for the first time in 11 years, since Sarah died, he felt it. He felt home, not just in the cabin, not just on the ranch, but inside him, whole. The travelling preacher came through town that month, all fire and brimstone. He got up on his soapbox, his voice booming, and started denouncing sin. And then, inevitably, he got to June. "No proper girl lives like that," he thundered, pointing towards the direction of Calder's ranch. "Shacked up with a man, no family, no history. She's a harlot, a curse on this community." A few townsfolk, already suspicious, echoed his words, their faces grim. Someone muttered about bad blood. Calder didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, on Sunday morning, watching June. She didn't go into town. Instead, she walked the ranch, slow and deliberate, a simple oil lantern swinging gently in her hand. Even though the sun was high, she checked the fences, watched the horses graze, gathered the eggs from the coop, calm as a stone, utterly unbothered. She walked the perimeter of the property, claiming the land, marking it as her own, without saying a single word. She just existed, peaceful and undeniable. The preacher finished his sermon, his words fading into the wind. The criticism died out too, unspoken, unable to stand against the quiet certainty of her presence. You could feel it, the shift. She had claimed her place and the land, and no one, not even a preacher, could tell her otherwise. That fall, Calder started building her a room of her own, a small addition off the main cabin, facing east so she'd catch the sunrise through the window. He measured, sawed, hammered, trying to make it perfect. He painted the walls a soft, creamy white, a colour he knew she'd like. It felt good, seeing the walls go up, knowing he was building something new, something for her. It wasn't fancy, just a simple, warm space. When he finished, she gave him a gift, a scarf, sewn from old shirt fabric, surprisingly soft. It was a dark blue, the colour of twilight, and it smelled faintly of lavender. "It's for the cold," she said, her voice a little stronger now, less a whisper. He wrapped it around his neck. It felt good, warm. "I never thought this place could hold peace again," he said quietly, looking around at the cabin, at the newly painted room, at her. He thought about the emptiness that had settled in after Sarah, the quiet that had felt like a suffocating blanket. She looked at him, her dark eyes clear and steady. "It's always been here," she responded, her voice soft but firm. "Just needed someone to listen." And she was right. It had. Spring came, green and lush, bursting forth from the winter-hardened ground. It wasn't just the land that was blooming. The townsfolk, once wary, now started dropping by the ranch, sometimes with a pie, sometimes with a basket of fresh eggs, or just to pass the time. Gentle words, tentative smiles. They came to see June, really, children especially. They'd wander over from nearby farms, drawn to her quiet way with animals, to the little garden she'd started. She'd teach them how to identify different wildflowers, how to coax a nervous lamb to drink milk. Every morning she'd write something on a small chalkboard she'd hung by the kitchen door. Simple words. One morning it read, "Today will be soft." Another, "The sun still rises." Calder found himself looking forward to it, a small anchor in the day. He was smiling more now, he noticed, laughing even. One afternoon he was talking to old man Miller, Billy's father, by the fence line. He was watching June with the children, tending her flowers. She didn't just survive, he told him, his voice gruff but full. She planted something. The world felt calm. The cabin, finally, was full. And as they sat on the porch, watching the last of the sunlight fade over the mountains, Calder realized that the quiet he had always known, the quiet he thought he wanted, had changed. It was no longer empty. It was home.